When my uncle passed away, I never expected to inherit anything more than a box of old tools or maybe a few photo albums. But when his lawyer called me in and revealed that I was now the rightful owner of his sprawling piece of land on the edge of town, I was stunned into silence. It wasn't just any property, it was nearly 5 acres of wooded paradise with a modest but sturdy cabin that he had built with his own hands. And as I stood there holding the keys and the paperwork that proved it was legally mine, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of grief, pride, and nervous excitement at the idea of starting a new chapter in my life away from the constant noise of the city. So I packed up my things, loaded them into my truck, and made the drive out to see what would become my new home. Only to discover that paradise came with a catch, because the moment I pulled up the gravel driveway and admired the cabin nestled between tall pines, I noticed a group of perfectly manicured lawns and cookie cutter houses just across the road, and I didn't have to ask anyone to know what that meant. I had moved directly across from a homeowners association community, the kind that prided itself on rules, fines, and nosy neighbors, and I would soon learn that one neighbor in particular, who everyone simply called Karen, was the self-appointed queen of the HOA. At first, I tried to ignore the stares from the other side of the street as I hauled my belongings inside, pretending not to notice the twitching curtains and the subtle shaking of heads. But I wasn't inside for more than 20 minutes before there was a knock at my door, sharp and aggressive, and when I opened it, there she was, Karen herself, with her bleach blonde bob, oversized sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, and a clipboard clutched to her chest as though it were a badge of authority. And without so much as a polite hello, she demanded to know who I was, why I was there, and whether I had gotten approval from the HOA move-in. To which I calmly explained that the cabin and the land were mine, inherited fair and square, and that my property was outside the boundaries of the HOA, meaning I owed them nothing and didn't have to abide by their laundry list of absurd rules. The look on her face was priceless, like I had just insulted her very existence, and she immediately launched into a tirade about community standards and property values, and how my rustic cabin would ruin the aesthetic of their pristine neighborhood. But I simply smiled and told her she had no authority over me, thanked her for stopping by, and closed the door, thinking that would be the end of it, though deep down I knew people like Karen never took no for an answer. And sure enough, the next morning I woke to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door, filled with pseudo-legal jargon about violations, noise ordinances, and landscaping requirements, none of which applied to me, but all of which reeked of Karen's meddling. And instead of getting angry, I decided to play it cool, tossing the paper into the fireplace and going about my day, setting up my uncle's old rocking chair on the porch and sipping coffee while Karen stood across the street glaring at me like a hawk waiting for its prey, her phone clutched in her hand as she snapped photos and whispered furiously to some poor HOA member who probably regretted ever picking up the call. Over the next week, the harassment escalated. She would park her car at the edge of my driveway. Claiming it was community parking, she would let her yappy little dog run into my yard and dig holes in the soil, and she even tried to block a delivery truck bringing me supplies by standing in the road with her arms crossed like some self-righteous traffic cop. But I stayed patient, documenting everything with photos and videos just in case I needed proof later, and it was a good thing I did, because the day finally came when I returned home from a quick grocery run and discovered my key wouldn't fit the lock on my own front door. At first, I thought I had grabbed the wrong set of keys, but no, it was the right one, and after several failed attempts, my stomach dropped as realization set in. Someone had changed the locks, and I didn't have to guess who, because there, taped smugly above the doorknob, was another bright notice with Karen's neat, overbearing handwriting that said, "This property is hereby seized under HOA authority until compliance is met," which was laughable considering the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land. But it wasn't funny in that moment, standing outside my own home with bags of groceries at my feet and the sinking realization that I had been effectively locked out by a neighbor drunk on power. My hands shook with anger as I ripped the paper off the door and crumpled it, but instead of immediately calling the police, I decided to take a step back and think strategically, because if Karen wanted a war, then a war she would get, and while she may have thought she had the upper hand by controlling the locks, she had no idea that I was far more resourceful than she imagined. nor that my uncle had taught me more than just how to maintain a cabin. He had taught me how to protect what was mine. And in that moment, staring at the locked door, I vowed that not only would I take back my home, but I would make sure Karen would regret ever trying to cross me. Because I wasn't just going to change the locks back, I was going to change her future. I spent the next several hours pacing around the cabin's porch, groceries spoiling in the late afternoon sun as I weighed my options, because part of me wanted to call the sheriff immediately and have Karen arrested for breaking and entering, but another part of me wanted to wait, to build a case so airtight that when the hammer finally came down, she wouldn't just get a slap on the wrist, but would feel the full weight of the law. So I called a locksmith instead, a friend of mine from town who owed me a favor, and when he arrived, I showed him the so-called HOA notice and the fresh locks, and though he chuckled at the absurdity of it, he shook his head and told me this wasn't just petty harassment anymore, it was a crime, and he advised me to document every detail and keep a record of the new locks he was about to remove, which I did with photos, timestamped videos, and even a signed statement from him once he finished replacing the locks with a sturdier, tamper-proof version that Karen wouldn't be able to manipulate so easily. But just as we were packing up, Karen stormed across the street like an enraged wasp, her sunglasses bouncing on her head and her dog yipping at her heels, and she began shouting about how I wasn't allowed to tamper with official HOA property, to which the locksmith politely reminded her that the only one tampering with property here was her, and that she was lucky he didn't call the police right then and there. But she only grew louder, drawing the attention of several neighbors who peeked out their windows, and I noticed some of them looked embarrassed, as if even they realized she was going too far. Yet none of them dared intervene, and Karen finally spat that I wouldn't last a month here before storming back to her pristine palace of a house, leaving me shaking my head at how far she was willing to go to exert power she didn't even have. Later that night, as I sat inside with the lights dimmed, I began reviewing the footage I had been collecting, and with each clip, my resolve hardened. There was Karen parking in my driveway, letting her dog ruin my yard, screaming about rules that didn't apply, and now physically breaking into my home. And I realized this wasn't just about her trying to control me, it was about her need to dominate everyone around her, to mold the world into her image of perfection, no matter who she trampled in the process. But what she didn't know was that I had patience, persistence, and an inherited stubbornness that ran deep in my family, and I wasn't going anywhere, so I made a plan. Instead of confronting her directly, I would let her dig her own grave, because people like Karen thrived on conflict, but they also thrived on attention, and the moment you stopped giving them what they craved, they doubled down until they exposed themselves. So I set up discreet cameras around the property, small trail cams my uncle had once used for hunting, hidden in trees and corners of the porch, and over the next 2 weeks, I caught everything. Karen trespassing, Karen scribbling fake violations, Karen screaming into her phone about how she was going to run me out, and even Karen at one point trying to drill into the side of my new lock before giving up in frustration and storming away. It was infuriating to watch, but it was also golden evidence, and as the days passed, I noticed her slipping up more and more, her arrogance blinding her to the fact that I was watching her every move, and while she thought she was wearing me down, I was quietly building a dossier that would ensure her downfall. But things escalated one Saturday morning when I returned from chopping firewood in the woods behind the cabin to find a group of HOA members standing in my driveway, led, of course, by Karen, who held a stack of papers and announced that they had voted to seize my land due to noncompliance with community standards, which was so absurd I nearly laughed, but I kept my composure as I asked them politely to leave my property, and when they refused, I pulled out my phone, hit record, and told them they had 5 seconds before I called the sheriff, which finally made a few of them scatter like guilty children. Though Karen stayed put, spewing threats about lawsuits and foreclosures until I calmly reminded her that she was trespassing and that every word she spoke was being recorded, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt cross her face before she turned on her heel and stomped off, muttering something about not being finished. That night, as I sat at my uncle's old desk, surrounded by stacks of neatly labeled evidence, I realized I didn't just want to stop Karen. I wanted to end her reign over the entire neighborhood, because if she could do this to me, someone who legally didn't even fall under her jurisdiction, then what had she been doing to the poor souls who actually lived under her thumb, forced to pay fines, cut grass to exact measurements, and beg for permission to paint their shutters? So I began reaching out discreetly to some of the other residents, casually striking up conversations at the general store, the post office, or while walking down the road, and slowly they began to open up, telling me stories of outrageous fines for trivial things, threats of liens on their homes, and constant harassment if they so much as disagreed with her at a meeting. And though many were too afraid to speak publicly, I saw the same spark in their eyes that I felt in my chest, anger mixed with hope, the kind of hope that comes from realizing you're not alone. And so my plan shifted from simple defense to full on offense, because Karen had underestimated me, underestimated my patience, and underestimated the loyalty my uncle's memory inspired in me. And if she thought changing my locks was going to chase me off this land, she had no idea that she had only lit the fire that would eventually burn her entire empire of control to the ground. By the time another week rolled around, I had gathered enough evidence to fill a binder thicker than a college textbook, but I wasn't ready to strike just yet, because I wanted Karen to show her true colors in front of everyone, not just me. So I devised a way to lure her into overplaying her hand, and the opportunity came faster than I expected when I received a notice in mail, this time an official-looking document with HOA letterhead, claiming that I owed over $3,000 in back dues and noncompliance penalties, which was laughable since I was never a member of their association. But what made it more interesting was the signature at the bottom. Karen's, scrawled in her dramatic, looping handwriting, as if daring me to challenge her authority. So instead of tearing it up like I did the others, I tucked it carefully into my binder, and the very next morning I marched over to her driveway, cameras rolling on my phone as I asked her, loud enough for her neighbors, to hear if she could explain why she was billing me for dues when I wasn't part of her HOA, and she, confident as ever, puffed out her chest and declared that all properties within visual range of the community were subject to its standards, which was not only insane but also legally baseless. And when I pressed her to cite a statute or ordinance, she sputtered before snapping that she didn't have to explain herself to me because she was the HOA. And that was exactly the slip I had been waiting for, because several of her neighbors were watching from their porches, whispering among themselves, and I could see from their faces that even they thought she sounded unhinged. So I calmly thanked her for clarifying on camera, turned around, and walked back to my cabin, leaving her shouting threats at my back like a spoiled child denied candy. That night, I compiled all my footage into neat folders, organizing clips by date and incident, and I even reached out to a lawyer friend of mine in town who, after a quick review, told me I had more than enough to press charges for harassment, trespassing, attempted fraud, and even potential mail tampering, depending on how Karen had fabricated the HOA letterhead. And while the idea of dragging her into court was tempting, I had something bigger in mind, because as much as I wanted to see Karen punished, I also wanted to free her neighbors from her chokehold of power, and the only way to do that was to turn her own tactics against her. So I started by mailing copies of her fake notices anonymously to several residents, highlighting the obvious forgeries and pointing out how she had no right to seize property or demand money beyond what the official bylaws allowed. And soon enough, whispers began to spread throughout the neighborhood. Whispers that Karen wasn't just a nuisance, but a liability, someone who was jeopardizing their entire community with her reckless power trips, and I could see the cracks forming in her empire as a few brave homeowners stopped by my cabin to thank me quietly for standing up to her, admitting they had long wished someone would. But none of them had dared because they feared retaliation, and I assured them that fear was exactly what Karen thrived on, and that the best way to defeat a bully was to strip away her illusion of control. But Karen, oblivious to the mutiny brewing under her nose, doubled down on her harassment, showing up one morning with a ladder and 2 HOA lackeys to tack a gigantic violation property sign to one of my trees, a move so theatrical I almost burst out laughing, but instead I let her finish, captured it all on my cameras, and even asked her politely if she'd like to smile for the recording, which made her face twist into rage before she stormed off. And I knew right then she was losing her grip, because people who are truly in control don't need to scream, don't need to escalate. They let their authority speak for itself, but Karen had none. and her tantrums were becoming so ridiculous that even her allies were beginning to distance themselves. Still, I kept my guard up because desperation makes people dangerous, and my caution proved wise when I came home late one night from dinner in town to find my porch light shattered, muddy boot prints on the steps, and a dead rat left in a box by my door with the words "Get Out" scrawled across the lid. And though I couldn't prove it was Karen, I didn't need to. The childish intimidation attempt reeked of her theatrics. And instead of frightening me, it only fueled my determination. So I called my lawyer friend, forwarded me evidence, and together we drafted a formal complaint to the county sheriff's office, complete with video files, photographs, and copies of every fraudulent notice she had left me. And though the sheriff himself was cautious, saying these things take time to investigate, I could tell he was unimpressed with Karen's antics, especially since he admitted she had a history of overstepping her authority, and that small comment made me realize I wasn't the first person she had targeted, just the first who refused to cave. So I doubled down on my plan, preparing not just to defend my cabin, but to liberate the entire neighborhood. And when the sheriff told me there would be a public hearing to address the growing number of complaints against her leadership, I knew it was my chance to put everything on the table, to show everyone just how far Karen had gone, because the truth was she hadn't just changed my locks, she had changed the direction of her own future without realizing it. And when the hearing came, I was going to be ready to make sure it was the turning point that ended her reign for good. The day of the public hearing arrived with the kind of tension you could feel in the air, like the charged silence before a storm. And as I pulled into the county building's parking lot, I could already see a cluster of HOA residents gathered outside, some whispering nervously, others looking determined, and at the center of it all was Karen, strutting around in a bright red suit, like she was preparing for a coronation rather than a reckoning, barking orders at anyone who would listen, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. But I noticed right away that the crowd wasn't rallying behind her like it once might have. Some crossed their arms, others rolled their eyes, and a few even avoided her completely as though they were ashamed to be associated with her. And when she spotted me, she narrowed her eyes and muttered something to the people beside her before stomping inside, clearly expecting that she was about to put me in my place once and for all. But when we entered the chamber, it became clear she was in for a very different experience, because the sheriff was already waiting at the front with a thick folder of documents I had provided, and a panel of county officials sat ready to hear grievances, their expressions neutral but firm. And as the meeting began, Karen wasted no time launching into a tirade about how I was a danger to community harmony, how my cabin was an eyesore, and how I had refused to pay mandatory dues, waving around her forged letters as though they were gospel. But when the sheriff asked her directly to point to the section of county law or HOA charter that gave her jurisdiction over my property, she stammered, then deflected, then finally declared, "Because I said so," which sent a ripple of gasps and muffled laughter through the audience, and that was my cue. So I stood calmly, presented my binder of evidence, and walked the panel through each incident: video footage of her trespassing, photos of her dog tearing up my yard, copies of the fraudulent notices with her signature, and even the recording of her admitting that she was the HOA, as if the entire organization was her personal kingdom. And with each piece of evidence laid bare, I could feel the weight of the room shifting, the murmurs growing louder. The neighbors who had once feared her now emboldened by the undeniable proof of her abuse of power. Karen's face went from red to pale to an ugly shade of blotchy purple as she tried to interject, but each time the sheriff silenced her with a raised hand. And finally, one of the panel members leaned forward and asked her the question that sealed her fate. "Mrs. Thompson, have you at any point falsified documents or misrepresented your authority to your neighbors?" And though she sputtered and tried to dance around it, the evidence spoke louder than her excuses, and the panel quickly voted to remove her from her position as HOA president effective immediately, pending further legal investigation into her fraudulent actions. And the look on her face in that moment was something I will never forget: shock, disbelief, and the dawning realization that her iron grip had finally been pried away. But the consequences didn't stop there, because as soon as the decision was read, several residents who had long suffered under her rule began standing up one by one, voicing their own experiences of harassment, unfair fines, and intimidation, their stories piling on like stones on a collapsing wall, and I sat quietly, watching the empire she had built crumble piece by piece, not because I shouted the loudest, but because I had given the truth a platform to speak for itself. After the hearing ended, the sheriff approached me privately and assured me that the county would be investigating the forged documents more seriously and that criminal charges were likely, especially with the fraudulent billing and lock changing stunt. And though part of me felt vindicated, another part simply felt relieved that my uncle's land was safe, that I had stood my ground, and that the people Karen had bullied for years finally had their voices heard. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood began to transform. Without Karen patrolling the streets like a self-appointed dictator, people seemed lighter, more willing to chat, more willing to help one another without fear of being fined for leaving a trash can out too long or planting the wrong type of flowers. And a few even stopped by my cabin with pies, firewood, or simply a thank you, telling me I had done what they never could. And though I told them it wasn't just me, that it was the truth, the evidence, and their courage to finally speak up, I could see in their eyes that they were grateful to finally breathe freely again. As for Karen, word spread quickly that she had not only lost her position, but was now facing charges for fraud and trespassing, and that her husband, embarrassed and exhausted by her antics, had quietly listed their house for sale. And though I never saw her again after that day in the county chamber, I sometimes imagined her staring at the for sale sign in her perfectly trimmed lawn, realizing that in trying to change my future by locking me out of my home, she had instead rewritten her own, and not for the better. Standing on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the pines, I thought about my uncle and how he had always said that land was more than dirt and trees. It was a legacy, something you protect with everything you have, not just because it belongs to you, but because it represents freedom, roots, and the right to live without fear of someone else's control. And I realized that inheriting his land had given me more than a cabin and a place to call home. It had given me the chance to stand firm, to prove to myself and others that bullies only win when you let them. And as I rocked gently in the chair he had built with his own hands, listening to the quiet hum of crickets in the woods, I couldn't help but smile, because Karen had tried to change my locks, but in the end, I had changed her future forever.